You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
So, hello everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Attila Norbert Ferenc, and I'm a member of MCC and also a member of Diplomaci project. My distinguished guest today is Dr. Calum Nicholson, who is an expert in sociology and about his background, he holds an undergraduate degree in social anthropology from the University of Cambridge, a master's in migration studies from the University of Oxford, and a PhD in human geography. He's a former visiting fellow at the University of Oxford, and he has also served as a researcher in the British Parliament. In Hungary, he's a visiting fellow of Mathias Corvinus Collegium and Danube Institute. And first of all, thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
At Danube Institute, you are currently researching the Hungarian, Hungary's position, if I'm not mistaken, but your expertise is about migration and sociology. And with that, you are currently researching the Christian community in Iraqi Kurdistan. And I would like you to tell us the basic information about the research project, like who are the researchers and what is the institutional framework of this project.
Sure. Well, the research project I'm involved in is run through the Danube Institute, although it's funded by Hungary Helps. And for those who don't know, Hungary Helps is basically Hungary's international development agency. In general, it helps Christian minority communities throughout the world. One project they have is in Iraq, in Kurdistan. If you go there, you can't throw a stone without hitting something built by Hungary Helps. It's very obvious when you're in Kurdistan how much of a role Hungary plays there. But not only are they doing practical projects, Hungary Helps is also researching or funding research into understanding the nature of the problems Christian communities are facing in different areas of the world, particularly in the context of fears of persecution. And so there's a project run by the Danube Institute, which has been looking at violence against Christians and persecution against Christians. It's looking at Christians in different countries. It was looking at Christians in Sudan and also Poland and some other countries. But the Iraq leg was the bit I joined. And there were 4 researchers, 2 Americans, including the lead researcher, 1 Hungarian and myself. And my national identity is a bit confusing, but it's mostly British. And so we went out to Iraq, I think, either auspiciously or inauspiciously on the 20th of March, 2023, which was exactly the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. So I discovered this on the flight, and I realized this was a strange date to be arriving. But we went there for 2 weeks, and we did research there, interviewing, I can go into more detail later, but we interviewed a lot of the clergy of different Christian churches there, and also ordinary Christians in the villages, among other people.
We'll return to this later, but now, what inspired you in accepting this task with the Danube Institute?
Well, I was approached to join it. I knew the researcher who was leading it. He's a friend of mine, and he knew my backgrounds in social anthropology, and that I have some experience of field work. And he asked me if I could join. I think it was important to have some researchers with just more fieldwork experience to join that. So that's why he asked me, and I was certainly keen to go. It's a part of the world I've always been interested in. I think I remember 20 years ago protesting the Iraq War when I was a student, and so it's a part of the world I remember following the news very closely. And so to actually go there was a great privilege, actually. But also quite eye-opening once we got there in terms of looking at what that war and what that invasion has done to the country.
Well, before going into details, what are the basic things that are good to know about the region for laymen?
Well, so we went to Kurdistan, but that was Iraqi Kurdistan. Kurdistan itself isn't a country. It's split between, there's a bit of Kurdistan in Iran, in Turkey, in Syria, and in Iraq. Iraqi Kurdistan is a basically independently governed area. There's the Kurdish government, and the Iraqi government in Baghdad have very little influence on what happens in Kurdistan. The Kurds have a separatist movement that went back to the 1960s and 70s. Saddam tried very hard to suppress it. It was only in the early 90s, or perhaps the very late 80s, and I think the early 90s, there was a no-fly zone put over Kurdistan, so Saddam couldn't drop, say, chemical weapons on Kurdish villages anymore. So the Kurds are a separate region. But to understand Iraq, it's worth noting there are Sunnis and there are Shia in terms of Muslims, but there are also Arabs and Kurds. Most of the Kurds are themselves Sunni, but they're not Arabs, and both are quite tribal cultures. In between that, you have a range of different minorities. One is the Yazidi minority, who people aren't that aware of, I think. Certainly weren't before the ISIS period, because they were very badly persecuted by ISIS. The Yazidis are they're not nomadic, but they're quite isolated. They're mostly shepherds, farming people. They have a religion which doesn't have a book, and they worship something called the peacock angel. And if you ask them to explain their religion, they'll just tell you how many people there are or something. They never actually get into the content of what they believe. And I wonder if that's partly because it's not encoded anywhere. It's not written down. And the reason they were very badly persecuted under ISIS was precisely because they were not people of the book. But there's also Christian minorities there. And the Christians are broken down into a range of different churches. The biggest one is called the Chaldean Church of the East. But there was also the Assyrian Church of the East, which it branched out from in the 17th century. In the 1960s, there was another schism. There's now the Ancient Church of the East, which ironically is the newest one. There's also the Syriac Orthodox Church and the Syriac Catholic Church. The Syriac Catholic Church is affiliated with the Vatican. And there are also a range of different evangelical churches, and there's also the Armenian churches as well. So there's lots of different Christian denominations in the country.
Well, in terms of numbers, how many Christians live there nowadays? And what could have been the peak number of their population during history?
Well, it's hard to say during history as such, but the last Iraqi census was in 1987, I believe. And that recorded 1.3 million Christians in the country. Since 2003, that is since the invasion of Iraq by the Americans and the Brits, the population of Christians has dropped by over 80%. And so they now say that there's 250,000 Christians. I have to say, having spoken to a range of people in a position to know what the real number is, the likelihood is the number is significantly smaller than that. It could be less than 100,000. But they have to sort of maintain the fiction or the idea that they have several 100,000 left, because in the Iraqi government, they only get representation if they meet a certain quota. And the likelihood is that they're far lower than that, for reasons that are quite interesting, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Well, this Christian minority, is it a religious or an ethnic minority, or both?
Well, this is quite an interesting question, because obviously, first of all, they're religious because it's in the name, they're Christians, right? But what's quite interesting is that certainly the Chaldean Christians have been lobbying, or rather their leadership have been trying to make them out to be an ethnic minority. The reasons for that are quite interesting, because it doesn't actually help, from the people we spoke to, it doesn't seem to actually help Christians in Iraq if they are identified as an ethnic group, because that creates more sources of division with their neighbors, their Muslim neighbors, their Kurdish neighbors, their Arab neighbors. But the reason that they are increasingly, the reason the leadership is pushing for them to be a ethnic minority is because of pressure from the diaspora. There are a lot of Chaldean Christians in places like Chicago in the United States. And the people who live abroad, who are part of the diaspora, like the idea that they are Chaldean as an identity, not just a religious identity, but they ethnically feel they are Chaldean. And obviously the diaspora provide a lot of funding back to Iraq to maintain the churches, to maintain what is left of the community. And so they have a great deal of influence over the community in Iraq, and because that's where the money comes from. And so their sense in America that they want to be ethnically seen as Chaldeans may make sense to them when they're sitting comfortably in Chicago. It doesn't necessarily mean it's helpful for Iraqi Christians who are just trying to keep their head down and not have tensions with the people around them. And so they are a religious minority. There is a political movement to make them an ethnic identity, particularly the Chaldean church. Whether that is good is an open question. And the crucial question is who is pushing for that? And I would say it's not being pushed by ordinary people in Iraq. It's being pushed by the clergy of the Chaldean church because they have very close connections to the diaspora where a lot of their funding comes from.
Well, it was very interesting. And I don't know for sure that how is it possible that the Christian community remained somewhat untouched during centuries there in the middle of an Arabic world. You said that their number is somewhat around 1 million people. It's a big community.
Well, I mean, it was. I mean, it was 1.3 million in '87. Now it's down to maybe 100,000. I would guess, if not less. I think the thing is that they haven't been untouched. I mean, the Christian and Muslim communities have had their tensions going back to the Crusades. That there's always been issues. I would say though that the 20th century led to a lot of communal tensions in different parts of the world, particularly under the European empires. So I have some familiarity, at least with the literature, on communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims in the 20th century in India. What's very interesting is that, just as an example, in India, until about 1930, Hindus and Muslims didn't really see themselves as distinct. There was some Muslims would go to the temples, some Hindus would go to the mosque. It wasn't clearly defined as in terms of these different groups. And the argument that some anthropologists have made is that the British Empire and the British colonial powers practiced a sort of divide and rule strategy. Partly this was created by things like the census, where people had to classify themselves as Hindu or Muslim and define what this was. And so previously you had a more organic culture where people muddled along next to each other. And then actually these divisions were highlighted and exacerbated by external powers who have their own political agendas. And then what you then see in India in the 1930s is an outbreak of communal violence between these groups. It then went away for a while, then it came back in the 90s. And now you have in India, for instance, the Hindu nationalist movement. The current government of India is Hindutva. It's a Hindu nationalist movement. And they're very hostile towards their Muslim neighbors. That's been a political act. It's not been the way it's always been. So I would say that obviously as a minority in Iraq and in the Middle East in general, Christians haven't always had an easy time. Same with any minority anywhere. But I think that it's been exacerbated the last few decades. I do think what the major issue that happened in the modern period in Iraq, which is worth noting, is that really under Saddam in the 1980s, there wasn't a problem with Hindus and Muslims. It's worth noting Saddam's deputy prime minister for his entire period in power from 1979 to 2003, his deputy prime minister was Tariq Aziz, who's a Chaldean Christian. So Saddam didn't have a problem with the Christians. He got on with the Christians pretty well. And the Christians actually had quite a good status in Iraqi culture under Saddam, who ran a basically secular regime. What happened was in the early 1990s, there was rising Islamist feeling and in the Middle East in general for various reasons. And Saddam decided the best way to counter this was not to suppress it, but for the government to indicate that it's trying to promote Islam. So he tried to resist this movement by adopting it to some extent. And he established something called the faith movement, which really foregrounded one's religious faith, particularly Islam, in someone's identity. And this meant in schools, there was more religious elements in schools. It meant Saddam himself used to start dressing more piously instead of more secularly, which he'd done before. And so what he did is he stewed some intercommunal tensions, but they never really exploded in the 1990s because people may not have liked their neighbors because of their religious differences, but that everyone feared the government more. No one wanted to call the police because the police would be there in 2 minutes and they would ask questions. What then happened as soon as Saddam left in 2003, that phone number to call the police shut down. It stopped working. And suddenly all of these tensions that had been fermented by Saddam as a political act to see off a rising Islamist movement in the Middle East, those tensions exploded. And so what you've seen in the last 20 years are an outbreak of tensions between Shia and Sunni, between Muslims and Christians, and indeed the Yazidis. And the most extreme example of this, of course, was what happened under ISIS.
Well, you have mentioned before the rule of ISIS, and I'm curious that what were the effects of this rule regarding the region?
Well, I mean, ISIS came like a storm out of the desert to some extent. I mean, they suddenly it appeared that way at the time. They were a sort of a millenarian, apocalyptic movement bent on destruction. The origin of them, allegedly, is in the demobbed Iraqi army, because in 2003, 2004, when the Americans took over Iraq, one of the first things they did was sack everyone in the Iraqi army. Instead of keeping all those mostly young men who had weapons and who had training, instead of using them to some advantage or managing them, they just sent them home as if they would go home and would not organize again. A lot of what happened with ISIS were just soldiers who'd been sent home, who still had their weapons, still had their training, and they re-emerged as this movement within a few years. First as insurgencies, but later as ISIS. The effect of ISIS was quite cataclysmic for everyone. Not all Muslims are fundamentalists, and I think that there was a minority, but it was a very loud minority. It's just like with anything, you can look at anything in society, that there's always a loud minority who control things. You go on social media, it's always like a loud minority dominating opinions. It doesn't mean they represent what the state of society is, but social media amplifies the extreme voices. ISIS was similar in some ways. And the effect was quite cataclysmic for any minority in the area. We talk about, the research project we went to Iraq in service of was concerned for the plight of Christian minorities in the wake of ISIS. But the people who really suffered were the Yazidis, precisely because they're not a people of the book, because they were seen as people who ISIS would not respect at all. And so whereas Christians were given the option of convert to Islam or go into exile, the Yazidis were basically told convert to Islam or we'll burn you to death. And most of them then were just burned to death if ISIS caught them. There's very few who would convert. And so it was quite apocalyptic, the effect of ISIS across the Nineveh plain and the Sinjar mountains particularly. The Yazidis bore the brunt of it. They had the hardest time. The Christians suffered too. But I think it's caused problems for everyone, obviously. I mean, Mosul was devastated. A lot of Muslims suffered. So I think the point with ISIS, much as the point with the invasion of the Iraq War in 2003, is that the problems faced by Christians there are not unique to Christians. That country has been devastated by war and by the after effects, the aftershocks, the tremors. It's been devastated, and everyone has suffered as a consequence. So I think one of the things that was quite interesting on the research project is we went there with a concern for Christian minorities. There's a real danger sometimes, though, when you approach it like that you have a confirmation bias, that you're only interested in Christians, so you think all the problems are Christian problems. What that we were really looking at often were Iraqi problems manifested in the Christian community. And I think this can be lost if we just focus on one element, for instance, the Christians. The basic problem there is political, it's historical. The country had a dictator, the dictator was deposed, the country was invaded. It was dealt with very simplistically by the Anglosphere who were leading that invasion, and we're seeing the consequences today.
Well, politically speaking, how much do the authorities care about Christians? Or in other words, do they have political rights? Are they threatened by officials?
They have rights. I mean, the minority status is protected in Iraq. The one thing to say in Iraq is that their constitution is built in a way where Sharia law, Islamic law, takes precedence over anything else. So basically, you can have anything in the constitution as long as it's not in violation of Islamic law. And I'm no legal scholar, but this is what I was told. And so, for instance, Christians have rights because they're people and they live they're citizens of Iraq. They don't have rights as Christians; they have rights as people who are citizens. One thing, though, that Christians are not allowed to do is to try and evangelize or convert any Muslim to Christianity. It doesn't mean they don't get people coming to convert. And we can come back to this, but there's something worth noting about conversions. We met one bishop who said they have three types of people. The bishop said, we don't go out and try and convert anyone because we're not allowed to. It would be very dangerous to try and do so. And we understand that our relationship with our Muslim neighbors is very much that there's an understanding that we don't step on their toes and they won't step on ours. But he says we have three types of people who do approach us to convert. He says, first, real converts, people who are Muslim who really want to become Christian. He says, we always try and actually dissuade them. We try and tell them, look, this will be bad for you. It'll be bad for your family. It'll be bad for us, the church. We ultimately, if you really want to, we have to do God's work and help you. But please think about it. It doesn't help anyone for you to do this. So basically, they try and talk any potential converts out of converting. But they said they have very few of those. The second type, they said, are the intelligence services who call them up and go, I want to convert to Christianity. And they can always tell on the phone when these people call them up that their intelligence service is just testing the church to see, are they doing converts? And they can tell very quickly that it's just someone testing them. The third type of convert, which speaks, I think, a lot to the status of Christians in Iraq, is Muslims who want to convert to Christianity, not because they actually want to convert to Christianity, but they recognize that if they become Christians, it'll be easier for them to leave Iraq to get a visa to America or Canada or the UK or somewhere. And this is true. A lot of the Christians you meet in Iraq, if you visit them at their homes, at some point they'll go into their bedroom and pull out from under their bed a box and they'll bring it to you and open it up, and inside's a Canadian passport. And as many of them have a Canadian or an American passport, it seems, that they're keeping for a rainy day. If the country collapses again, they're gone. And this is an interesting thing with Christians in Iraq, is that we often look at them as a persecuted minority. There's actually another way of looking at it. You can look at them as persecuted. You can also look at them as the only community in a devastated, chaotic, war-torn country who have the option to leave. And I think this is evidenced by the fact that many Muslims would consider conversion to Christianity precisely to get that opportunity. The refugee camps full of refugees in the Middle East, they're not full of Christians, they're full of Muslims, because the Christians don't need them. The Christians can get to Europe or North America. So you can look at it and say Christians are unusually persecuted as a minority and they've all fled Iraq. Or you can say maybe they've all fled Iraq. Maybe they've all left because they can. Just one stat for you to illustrate this. My understanding is that since 2003, over 1 million Iraqis have migrated or moved to the West since the invasion. 40% of those are Christian. Now, Christians made up 1 to 3% of Iraq's population, but they make up 40% of the people who fled. That's not necessarily because they're more persecuted than everyone else. It's because they have more opportunity to leave. And so the question is, are Christians more persecuted, or in the face of chaos, are they more able to escape chaos? There's two different perspectives you could reasonably argue, I think, on that.
Well, these two questions should be answered, and I think that your research project would do so. But returning to churches, in the beginning of our conversation, you said that there are many churches, different churches like the Orthodox, and other Christian minorities. And my question would be that or is there a hierarchy inside the Christian community?
Well, I'd say two things. First, between the churches, and the five I was more familiar with, that is the Assyrian Church of the East, the Chaldean Church, the Ancient Church of the East, the Syriac Orthodox, and the Syriac Catholic. One thing I know is that those churches, they get on with each other. There's a small enough Christian community, they have to collaborate to some extent. But I do know there's a bit of tension between them. The tension manifests mostly in the context of international aid. So, for instance, Hungary helps, the Hungarian government's development agency, have quite rightly been very proud of bypassing local governments or governments and going directly to the churches. So when Hungary Helps donates money to Iraq, it doesn't give it to the Kurdish government, it doesn't give it to the Iraqi government, it gives them to the churches to handle. One of the issues that emerges as a consequence, though, is if the churches feel that one church has received funding from an organization like Hungary Helps and another hasn't, it creates what one bishop called unseen violence between the churches. It breeds tensions between them. So I think as foreigners or foreign organizations intervening in Iraq in any way, there needs to be, one I think needs to be very conscious of the unintended consequences of the generosity and the benevolence that is shown. So I think that's one factor about not so much hierarchy between the churches, but rivalry. In terms of hierarchy within the churches, this is probably one of the most interesting things that came out of the research. I certainly did. We spent the first week of that project going and interviewing senior members of the clergy, so bishops, archbishops, people like that. And they were very interesting, but you quickly recognize after a couple of days, they're just a bunch of politicians. They understand we're foreigners there, they have their set speech, they'll tell you their set speech because they're trying to sculpt a narrative that at the end of it you think we should give these people more money. And that's entirely their right, and you'd understand why they're like that. But the problem is, it is a very slick presentation. And so what I did after a week is I left the meetings with these senior figures, and I just hitchhiked on an ambulance out to a village. And I spent several days just wandering around these villages, having cups of tea with people. And very quickly you network. You meet a bunch of, I showed up in one town. There were these 4 old men sitting at a plastic table having a cup of tea. It was kind of a one-horse town. It almost felt they should have some tumbleweed and a saloon bar, like a cowboy movie in the desert. And I met them, and then they introduced me to their friends, and then one guy, no one spoke very good English, and I speak about 10 words of Assyrian, which is the language they speak. And someone then said, "Oh, you should meet our friend. He speaks really good English." And this guy showed up, and he did speak very good English. And I said, "Where did you learn English? Your English is amazing." And he goes, "Oh, you'll never have heard of it, in a town called Nyíregyháza in the country of Hungary." And I went, "Oh, Jónapot kívánok." And he goes, "Oh, Jónapot kívánok." And so there I was, a Budapest-based Scot meeting an Assyrian Christian in Mesopotamia, and we greet each other in Hungarian, which was, I think, quite interesting. But anyway, the point of this story about the hierarchy within the church is that having met this guy, I then he introduced me to some of his friends. And I spent a few days just walking the fields around their community with them, just interviewing them about their lives and their experience as Christians. To what extent do they feel that their identity is Christian? To what extent has that affected their prospects? Have they faced persecution? And I assumed we'd get a similar story to the bishops about persecution from Muslims or from the Kurdish government or something. It's not what we heard. What I heard was this one guy said to me, he said, we don't really face persecution. He said, yeah, ISIS was bad for everyone. That was a bad experience. But he says, in general, in our daily lives, we're not facing persecution, but we do face discrimination. But he said, we don't face discrimination from the government because we never meet them. They go through the churches. And we don't face it from Muslims because we live in a Christian village, and the Muslims, we don't really meet very many of them. And I said, actually, since ISIS, we get on with them pretty well because a lot of Muslims now are so ashamed and embarrassed by ISIS that they go out of their way to be nicer to us. And so that's not really the issue. He says the real source of discrimination for a lot of young, ordinary people in these Christian villages is discrimination within the church. And I asked him what he meant. And he gave me an example. He said that he gave an example of there's a village in the Nineveh plain called Teleskov. Teleskov was known for the Battle of Teleskov, where ISIS confronted the Kurdish Peshmerga, and there was a big battle. It's famous because a US Navy SEAL was killed in the battle, and no one knew the Navy SEALs were there, so it was a big thing. And ISIS were obviously defeated. The town was flattened in the course of this battle. Hungary Helps then donated millions, I think, of euros, according to these guys, to help rebuild this town, and they did a great job. But Hungary Helps gave the money to the local bishop to manage that project. And what we heard from these people, he said the problem was that as the project was winding down, as the project was coming to its closure after a couple of years, the bishop didn't keep on the people who were the most skilled at the jobs, nor the people who needed the jobs most. He simply kept on the people who he was closest to, even people who often had a job already and maybe didn't have any of the skills needed. And so he said this is an example that if you're not close to the bishop, you don't get anything. You don't get the jobs, you don't get the scholarships, you don't get the opportunity to go abroad and therefore get a passport. And so much of their lives is governed around how close you are to the church, not just whether you attend church, but whether you're close to the bishop. And so he says that in your day-to-day life, if you're just an ordinary person in these villages, your life is more governed by that sense of discrimination within the church, or that sense of preference, or your life is, and your opportunities are decided on whether you get on with the people who have the power.
You somewhat answered my next question, which would be the attitude of Western countries towards Kurdistan. And it seems to me that this small region concerns Western countries pretty much. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems to be that Christian minorities do get a disproportionate amount of aid. I mean, a lot of organizations say they don't. There's an organization called Open Doors who is a Christian charity that helps Christian minorities. And I think often people think that Christians around the world are given a raw deal, that they're not. When we think of people who are persecuted, we don't think of Christian minorities. In the same way, people say, well, when we think of discrimination today in the United States, people think of discrimination against minorities and so on, but no one talks about like the white working class who are usually treated as being as Hillary Clinton said, a basket of deplorables, which is a form of prejudice if I've ever heard one. But I do think that Christians, I think that the sense of them being singled out for persecution and not represented, I'm not sure I really agree with that, because from what I've seen, again, a lot of these people had British or Canadian or American passports. They do have funding coming in from international organizations. American evangelical Christians have an absurd amount of money, and they do spend it on Christian minorities. So I think there is a strong interest in Christian minorities around the world, and I think it is of interest in the West. But I might just add on that there's, when you think about, actually, I'll leave it because I think you may want to come back to it later. But I was going to talk about what the real problem is facing the Christian communities.
Yes. My next question is about their problems, and I think that you've described their situation in a big complexity, but little words were about their problems, and I'm very interested in the most pressing issues they face nowadays. And in your opinion, what is it?
Well, if you go and speak to the bishops there, what they almost all seem to say is the problem we face here is Islam. And I think that's nonsense, because first of all, it presumes there is something intrinsic to Islam that is violent. And I don't think that's how ideologies work. That's like someone saying Christianity is naturally violent. A faith is a faith. It's interpreted by different people in different ways. Under different circumstances, people emphasize different elements. I think to say Islam is intrinsically this or that is sort of missing the point. And you can certainly look at the Quran and say, well, it says this in the Quran, but it also says things in the Bible. Doesn't mean everyone has to interpret things in the most extreme way. So, but I'd understand why a religious figure would see things in terms of faith. Interestingly, we interviewed a former governor of Kurdistan, or governor of Erbil, I think actually, and he, which is a city there, and I asked him what the real problem was, and he said, well, the problem is political economy. He says the political economy was very bad, and that led to the rise of ISIS. And then we spoke to a Yazidi activist, and I said, so what was the problem with ISIS? And she said, well, it's group psychology because of this sort of collective group psychosis that led to ISIS. Now, if you pull back at that pattern, religious people see the problem as religious. A governor interested in the political economy and spreadsheets thinks the problem is a spreadsheet. It's the political economy. And an activist interested in traumatized Yazidi women who suffered under ISIS sees things in terms of trauma and psychology. So everyone sees the problem through the lens of their own disciplinary or professional bias. And I think we need to take that into account as researchers looking at any situation like this. What I would say is that if I look at the broader problem, is that the problems or the sources of conflict in Iraq, of persecution and conflict, were not internal, still less to do with faith per se, but external and to do with broader politics. So first of all, obviously, it was the US-led invasions which led to the removal of Saddam, which destabilized the whole region. Without that invasion, we wouldn't have had the last 20 years in the same way. They would have had other problems, but it wouldn't have been chaos. And it's worth noting that if you speak to Christians there was one guy we knew who said, and the quote was, he said, we regret the loss of Saddam. And I said, why? He said, look, under Saddam was a brutal dictator, but you knew that if you kept your head down, you'd probably be okay. But he says now it's just in the last 20 years, you never know if you're going to be okay. You never know if something's going to happen. They don't have as many car bombings now, but they did for a long time. So the US-led invasion was an external factor that destabilized the region. A second example of external influence is what I mentioned before about the Chaldean church diaspora internationally saying, well, we want to identify as an ethnic group. Now, as I said, that may work really well in Chicago. It may satisfy someone in Chicago who lives there quite comfortably in the suburbs and wants to think of themselves as an ethnic Assyrian or Chaldean Christian. But in Iraq, it's not helpful for more divisions to be drawn between the Christian communities and the Muslim communities. It creates more tensions. So that's another example of an international priority or agenda influencing the domestic situation. But a third example is also what I mentioned about international agencies like Hungary Helps, for instance. When they go there to do good and to help people. There's always the unintended consequences of creating what one bishop called this unseen violence between the churches, this rivalry for international aid and resources. But the final example of this, of an international agendas affecting what's going on there, is actually the role of foreign Christian evangelicals. Because, as I mentioned earlier, there is a kind of unwritten agreement, perhaps even written agreement, between the indigenous churches to Iraq, the Chaldean church and so on, and the government and the Muslim community, that the Christians will not evangelize. They will not try and convert Muslims to Christianity. And as long as they don't, they're left alone, basically. But a lot of foreign evangelical churches come in, typically American, and they either are ignorant of this agreement or they ignore it because they just want to convert people. And they don't really care about the effect on the broader community, or they don't know about it. And so this then provokes interfaith violence because to the Muslim community, they don't make a distinction between an evangelical American church and a church that's been there 1,500 years or 1,800 years. They just see Christians. And so from my perspective, and again, we didn't spend very long there. We spent a couple of weeks, but it's long enough to get a flavor for what the questions were, if not the answers. My interpretation was that the real problem they face there is the sort of blunt instrument of international agendas and intervention, however well-meaning. And there's a great phrase you'll know in English that is, you probably have the same in Hungarian, which is, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big dangers there. And I think this is, like, I lecture on international development. And one thing I always say to students about international development is precisely that there's no more people who've done more harm than those who go about trying to do good. That we can approach something with the best intentions, but if we're not careful about what it actually means on the ground, then we can end up doing more harm than good.
Well, for me, it's a completely new perspective, and based on your opinion and experience, what are the future prospects and future possibilities of this community?
Well, I suppose it depends what we mean by future prospects, because, if it's a case of, well, at the moment, I'll put it this way, my understanding is at the moment, there are more Assyrian Iraqi Christians, I think, in the city of Chicago, I think, than there are in Iraq. And I may be wrong on that, but it's something like that. Like the diaspora, I think, is bigger than the population that is there. And actually their sense of identity as Assyrian Christians is very strong in Chicago. And so these communities have a future, but whether that is in Iraq is different. And I think in terms of the prospects in Iraq, we've been living through a period of history where our identity and religious identity or ethnic identity or any other identity, really. Look at the culture now. A lot of these sort of social justice issues are all about identity. People are obsessed with identity. And we're in a period where this stuff is very strong. And now that may change in 10, 15 years. Maybe the culture will shift, fashions will change, and people will be less preoccupied with these ideas. But then again, maybe not. So I suspect what's going to happen is the communities there will dwindle, as they are already, and they will continue to leave. And at a certain point, if there's not enough people to maintain a community, if there's no one showing up to church, then there is no congregation. And if there's no congregation, there's no point having a bishop there. If there's no point having a bishop there, you're not going to maintain the churches. And slowly the villages fall into decline. And this is what's happened throughout history for lots of different reasons to lots of different communities. But at the same time, when you're there, you see there's a great deal of pride in their local communities. I'll give you one little story on this. I went to the town of Alkosh, and Alkosh is just at the bottom of the mountains, about half an hour from the city of Duhok, and just at the edge of the Nineveh plain. And it's such an old Christian community. It was name dropped in the Bible, like it's old. And this is where I met this guy who was educated in Hungary. And one day I was walking with him and his friend in the fields, and we'd had this interview about the town of Teleskov I mentioned. And we're walking back through these fields, and ahead of us is the village on the edge of the mountains. Up on the mountainside is this 1,800-year-old monastery, beautiful area. And both of them start to sing. And I discovered later that they knew each other. They were both about 30. They knew each other because they had been choir boys in the church going back 20 years, 25 years or whatever, 22 years. So they've known each other all their lives. And they were very good singers. And they were singing these beautiful songs as we're walking back in the fields. And eventually I said, so what are you singing about? And he said, well, we're singing in our local dialect and our local accent. And we're singing songs about our town, about the harvest, about the mountains, but not just in general, about their specific town. And these are songs that have been sung in their village and passed down for hundreds of years. These two guys were great people, very, very smart, thoughtful people. One of them was like a personal trainer. The other was an academic. They were very articulate, multilingual. They could, they had a lot of prospects to do different things, high energy. But they loved their town, and they were still there. And as long as people like that remain in those communities, they've got a future. But otherwise, demographically, it doesn't look very good. But one thing I learned there is a strong sense of identity among those Iraqi Christians. And there were some even who'd made their fortune in America and had moved back. And they had these nice houses now, and it was the old country, which is a very common thing. You can find this in a lot of communities where people will be, that they'll move to America and then they'll move back. A lot of Hungarians, we live in Hungary here, and there's a lot of 56ers who went off to America, either as refugees or just later to get away from communism. But now there's a whole bunch of people in the 60s, 70s, and 80s you meet in Hungary who very proudly returned to their homeland. And I think I suspect that's what will happen with Iraq, is that as Iraq settles down, if it does, and it has already settled down to some extent, who knows, maybe in a couple of decades, there'll be a restoration of the communities.
Well, I'm pretty sure that the 2 weeks spent there could be very extraordinary, and the experience you said me is just enlightening. And my final question would be that if you should briefly summarize their situation, what would you say?
Of the Christians there now?
Yes. Or about the research project, including.
I see. In terms of both, I mean, the Christian communities there at the moment, there's different Christian communities. Their circumstances vary. I mean, there's an area called, I think it was called Nala, I think it was. There was a valley, and the Christians there face slightly unusual circumstances with regard to the Kurdish government. Like checkpoints, their valley close earlier than the other valleys. There's military checkpoints everywhere, which makes it difficult. If you're a farmer and you're trying to bring fertilizer into the valley, there's a lot of paperwork, which means it can hold it up a month, which means you miss the harvest. And they see these all as forms of persecution. It could just be bureaucracy. It could just be corruption. I think at the end of the day, the Christian communities face a broader problem there of being a sort of non-tribal culture in the middle of tribal cultures. And the nature of a tribal culture is that the tribe always comes first. And so the Kurds are very tribal, the Arabs are very tribal, the Christians do not seem as tribal. But as a consequence of that, they will never really be well served by, say, the Kurdish government or the Iraqi government, because the priorities there are always tribal. And so I think their situation is tricky, but that's often the case for minorities. In terms of the research project, I'm not entirely sure. There's a broader. It's a part. The trip we did to Iraq is part of a bigger project on violence against Christian communities in general. In terms of my own elements of it, I mean, I've been writing up some thoughts, a few of which I've mentioned in this. But in general, I think my angle, rather than the project's angle, but certainly my angle is, I think we need to question this narrative about persecution or violence against Christians per se, because I do think in Iraq, by my observation, a lot of the problems they face are Iraqi problems. They're not Christian problems. There are a lot of problems, less of persecution, but of deprivation, because it's an area of chaos. And indeed, there's a lot of discrimination, but that discrimination is not, as I said, from the government per se or from the Muslim community, but from within the Christian community. And I think there's a lot of counterintuitive sort of results, I suppose, from my research and the interviews I did about the role of international aid, that we often think we go there and we can help. We think if we bypass the government, go straight to the churches, it's you're going to have a better result. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a correct assumption. But that observation is not unique to this project. I've done quite a lot of work around international development, looking at patterns of it over the decades. And the problems, I think, being faced, or the problems I've highlighted there are quite common, I think, in international development circles. So, I think in terms of the value of the project we're doing, I think it's important, if any action by any institution is going to have the intended effect rather than a range of unintended consequences, and perhaps not even the original effect that was intended, it needs to know not just what ought to be, but also what is. It needs to know what is actually happening on the ground. And crucially, the other thing international development organizations need to know is a very crucial, they need to consider a very crucial point, which is that ought does not imply can. Just because you think you ought to do something doesn't mean you can do it. And I think this is something that all international aid agencies need to be very conscious of. There was a great failure in Iraq of the Brits and the Americans when they were trying to develop Iraq and nation build there, is they thought just because they ought to do it, they thought they can do it. But what was proven in Iraq is that they spent all this money based on a dream of what they wanted to achieve. But in the end, they could not do it. And we now see the result. The Taliban is back. Afghanistan has collapsed again. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, that I think we should approach things like international development with more humility. And I think to some extent, and this is to quote a great hero of mine, Rory Stewart, who's a brilliant British writer and politician, he said, looking at the failures in Afghanistan of the intervention, he said, perhaps we don't need an anthropology of Afghanistan so much as we need an anthropology of ourselves. And I think this is very much how I see the role of anthropology. My background's in anthropology, is that I think sometimes what we need is not so much sociology or indeed anthropology of the people we try to help in some way, the Iraqis in this case, the Iraqi Christians. I think sometimes we need to have a sort of reflexivity to consider, why do we have the assumptions we have? Why do we have the assumptions we have about what we can do, what we ought to do? We often have these assumptions. And sometimes it kind of presumes, I find in international development, we presume ourselves to be like minor gods, where we presume that we can know the truth of a problem, that we are omniscient. Then we think, well, if we know the truth of the problem, we clearly must be able to solve it. So we have the power to solve it. So guess what? We're omnipotent. And we think, well, because we're omniscient and we're omnipotent, because we know the problems, we think, and the solutions, and therefore we should be able to implement them, we think we should legitimately do this everywhere. We should be omnipresent. And it's very interesting with international development. Implied in international development, I think, is a sort of hubris of thinking that we are above culture, above history, above contingency, that we can find the truth of the problems, that we can intervene and change things and do so successfully. And I think that's the big thing that research should be challenging, is the danger of hubris in our thought and our action. And if I have any hope in terms of what the research project might do, it might be to offer some reflections that lead to more humility in thought and action around these sorts of issues.
Well, it was an excellent summary of this longer podcast carried out by Diplomaci project. I think that this is the end of our podcast, and Dr. Calum Nicholson, thank you very much for taking your time with me.
Köszönöm szépen.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.